That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to a brand spanking new episode of The Fear of God. This is, in fact, episode 30. This is one of your hosts, Nathan Rouse. Typically with me is Reed Lackey. Unfortunately, at the moment, he is perched atop a small statue, also called a bust. And quoth the lackey, nevermore. Just kidding. There you are, Reed. Welcome back to the show. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing quite well.
Good.
Glad to be here. Glad to be having another conversation.
Yes, I'm glad to be having a conversation. I'm glad to see you.
Yeah.
I want to say I've really been enjoying the Universal Horror series we've been doing. Last 2 weeks was Bride of Frankenstein in May. May is what it is. Definitely enjoyed Bride of. But we're going to move away from those for a string of episodes here, in favor of a pretty special one. I know this is, today's episode or today's content we're talking about today is something, in the earliest stages of what would become this, highfalutin podcast. I remember you talking about wanting to get around to this and specifically sort of the special element we're going to be employing as part of this episode. I remember you hatching that. So why don't you fill us in, what are we talking about today? We did just allude to it rather directly. What are we talking about today? What's sort of the special element associated with that?
Certainly. So, our content today, delighted me for a number of reasons. As you already mentioned, when I was first conceptualizing the show, The Fear of God, I had a handful, maybe 5 or 6 episodes that I knew, hey, this would be an opportunity to do an episode about this film, about this work of literature, about this musical number, all kinds of things that I thought, hey, this would be beyond the spectrum of something that's necessarily talked about. And one of the ideas that I had was to talk specifically about this poem. Now, when we had a listener survey last year, towards the end of last year, I was delighted when I tossed this poem along with another selection of works of literature, and we asked you, the listeners, which one would you like us to talk about? And you also selected this poem. What do I mean by this poem? I'm talking about Edgar Allan Poe's iconic late 19th century poem, The Raven. This is one of the most famous poems in all of literature. You've read it. If you haven't read it, you've heard it somewhere or heard some sort of piece of it. But we wanted, when we talked about this, to approach things in a slightly different way than what we're used to, because being a poem, it has some opportunities for content that we don't necessarily get to indulge when we're talking about films. So what we're going to do is something very special, and this involves officially the first celebrity guest on The Fear of God. So I want to tell you a little bit. I have a buddy, Bill Oberst Jr. He is a very hardworking man in the horror genre. He has made over 150 films and TV appearances in the last 10 years alone. He's most notable for appearing as like a monster or a villain of some sort. He's appeared on shows like Criminal Minds, some of those procedural shows, Scream Queen. He has won an Emmy for a short form internet video. You need to pause what you're doing right now and Google, or when you finish the episode, Google something called Take This Lollipop, which sounds very silly. You need to have a Facebook in order to properly enjoy it. And you need to input your Facebook information. I promise you it's safe, although it will not feel safe. But Google Take This Lollipop and you will see some of Bill's finest work for which he has won an Emmy. But I met Bill at
you say that you allude to that sounding silly. I beg to differ. That does sound quite terrifying just on the surface.
Well,
Take This Lollipop. Like, that's just, it's inviting violence and terror. It's threat. It's like Mr. T, like, I pity the fool who tries to take this lollipop. You know, I know, I haven't seen the thing, but I'm going to look it up with dread in my spirit.
It is quite freaky. Well, I met Bill at a Christian comics and pop culture convention. Actually, it was a year prior to the same one that you and I attended this past year.
Nice.
And Bill and I struck up an immediate friendship. We began to talk occasionally. Periodically, we would call each other and just, briefly chat about life and faith and all these different things. He's an interesting guy because he always plays these very monstrous and sometimes even demonic monsters and villains. But in person, he is one of the most gentle, humble, warm human beings you're likely to meet. He's very friendly and he's an incredibly good actor. I think he's really a very talented man. If you're looking for some of his film work, I would point you to a horror film called Resolution. Also one called The Retrieval that was a Civil War drama where he's really good in it. You could also check out, if you're into scary clowns, you could check out a film called Scary or Die to see some of his more intense horror work, which was directed by Bob Badway, who's another gentleman that I met at the convention and follows our show and is a really good guy. So what we've got for you today, I reached out to Bill and he was gracious enough to give us a Fear of God exclusive. So we have for you, the listener, for your listening enjoyment, we have got a new interpretive reading of The Raven by Emmy award-winning actor Bill Oberst Jr. So we wanted to present this to you in a way that was fresh and something that you, like I said, we might not have gotten the opportunity to do with a film. So what we want to invite you to do is we want to invite you to kick back for a few minutes, relax, and we want you to hear this language, the text of this poem, freshly before we have a conversation about it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy what I think is a very powerful reading.
It's exceptional. He's really good.
Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven by Bill Oberst Jr. Enjoy.
Once, upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. To some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. The silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently, my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir, Said I, madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door that I scarce was sure I heard you, and here I opened wide the door. And darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the darkness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon I heard again a tapping, somewhat louder than before. Oh, surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see, then, what there is and what this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not an instant stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched above a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, I said, thou art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for who can help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whose unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and bust and door, and then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violent lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by angels whose faint footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he has sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore? Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart. Take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore.
Fear of God exclusive reading of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, performed by Bill Oberst Jr. Thank you very, very much, Bill, for your time and efforts putting that into us.
Thank you, sir.
So let's dive in now to this poem. Nathan, you obviously, being a well-educated man, you encountered this poem probably the same way I did when you were in grade school. You got any sort of personal memories or reflections about this particular poem?
Nevermore. Believe it or not. Okay, so here we'll do like we did, was it Frankenstein or Dracula? No, or The Exorcist? One of those we did this with. So like, what is your pop culture reference for The Raven? And I'm gonna steal what you might go for, because honestly, it is the most burned into my brain and memory is The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror version of The Raven. Like, that, I mean, I'm sure I read this as part of a literature class in high school or even prior to that, sort of like some of these Universal movies. This is just feels ingrained, it is. I mean, it is ingrained in the culture of Western civilization, basically, in terms of, monuments of literature. And so, there's ways in which it feels like, well, have you actually read it? Or are you just that familiar with it based on the culture? That's right. A little hard to say, but, specifically the Simpsons version of this is a lot of fun. I feel bad now because I knew in saying that I was going to steal yours. Are there others that you can think of?
that I'm familiar with, no, but yeah, I think that Simpsons would probably be the hinge point for me in terms of a pop culture reference. I mean, Dan Castellaneta, he does a fantastic performance of that.
It's excellent. I was going to say, I'll let you, since I stole your Simpsons, we'll pretend that you stole the other one that I would have referenced, and that's the late 90s, now mid 2010s returned Christian ska band Five Iron Frenzy heavily samples The Raven in there, The Untimely Death of Brad. So you can go look that one up. I mean, good job, Reed. Good job for referencing that one. I'm impressed.
Yeah, I figured you would be. That's why I brought it up.
But no, God. I mean, it's the point we're trying to make here, I think, is just, it has permeated the culture, in the best of ways.
Even if all you know is that Nevermore refrain. I mean, that Nevermore refrain echoes beyond where...
I mean, that kind of is the poem.
Where people don't even necessarily know or understand what the poem's about. They just remember hearing it sometime and they're like, isn't this from The Raven? And that's one thing that when I knew we wanted to have an episode about The Raven specifically, and again, I was so glad that the listeners picked it in terms of one of our first literary works to cover, aside from Witches, was I know that it can be easy to disconnect from it because, it's so familiar. So because it's so commonplace and so accessible to everybody, people don't necessarily revisit it. And it's a masterful poem. It is my number one favorite poem by anyone. I think it's a very, very powerful examination of grief and loss. I think there's a tremendous amount of substance to it. I think you could dissect it line by line almost and get something meaty out of it. So yeah.
See, now I'm gonna put you on the spot because you say something like, it's probably my favorite poem of all time. And I've just got to know, inquiring minds want to know, like, is there a list? Is there a Reed Lackey list of best? I mean, you've got your 2017 March reworking of your top 200 horror movies or movies, for March of 2017. Like, is there a list, or are you just like, oh, y'all, yeah, that's my favorite poem ever? Like, like, no, right behind that is a close second is Canterbury Tales.
Wow, that's hysterical. Well, I didn't say epic poems, like you're going to put me on the spot with
the
those.
Gilgamesh.
No, to be honest, the reason The Raven gets the number one spot is because it's one of the precious few poems that I keep returning to. I'm not a big poetry lover. As avid of a reader as I am, I'm not as affectionate towards poem. I think probably my second favorite poem ever would probably have to be All Along the Watchtower by Bob Dylan. So
there you go. See, I was about to say, like, poetry.
He's a Nobel Prize winner for literature.
He is.
So it counts.
But he didn't accept it, right? He didn't even reply.
No, he accepted it.
I don't know that he did. We need to look this up.
I'm gonna look this up.
Yeah, we need to do that.
I'm gonna have to give him my Bob Dylan fan card credentials if he didn't accept it.
We need to look this up after we record and talk about it next week on the next episode and reference.
Exactly.
Anyway, the point, you made my point that I was about to make for me, and that's that, we talk specifically, you say you're not a huge poetry fan, but I think if we're all being honest with each other, we're all quite big poetry fans because songwriting is poetry, right?
Yeah, I agree. No, I absolutely agree.
I mean, I would agree with you that I rarely just crack open a book of poetry. But, I do enjoy spinning some tunes.
So about this one specifically, I had a couple of trivial bits, which we're now gonna...
Yes, now time for trivial bits.
Trivial bits is just a thing that we do now, but...
It is now.
Edgar Allan Poe is a writer he was popular at the time. He was known in his day, but he was not financially successful. Some of that was just sort of the copyright laws of the day. Some of that was his own poor financial mismanagement. But he did write The Raven specifically because he wanted to write something that would be both critically praised and commercially successful. So he was trying his best to kind of throw everything he possibly could into this poem, and it worked. It brought him tremendous popularity. Now, it did not, for reasons we've already alluded to, it did not bring him very much financial success. He very much lived and died a poor man, but The Raven made him famous. A lot of his writings prior to The Raven were, largely unknown. He did sell a few poems and a few short stories before that, but it was The Raven that really, sort of his breakthrough moment in the literary world. But it's fascinating to me that it seems like there went through this long stretch of time where people were really acknowledging of its critical praiseworthiness. And then it seems like now more and more people are saying, oh, well, is The Raven really that good? Is The Raven really worth, us all studying it in literature in grade school and everything? And I still feel yes, but again, I studied it in literature in grade school, and I feel like it's probably my favorite poem. So naturally, I'm going to be biased towards it. Is it something that you, again, both of us, I think, would admit not being very avid poetry fans? Where's The Raven in your sort of thought world? Like, do you give it much consideration at all? Is it just something where it's brought up, it's like, oh yeah, that's The Raven, and move on?
That's my favorite poem of all time. I mean, it's number
one. You thief! I know that's not true.
No, I mean, I like it a lot, and especially revisiting it for this particular episode. I mean, I was struck again, and kudos to Sir Oberst. There's just something fun about the language.
Yes.
I am a Shakespeare fan. I do like well-performed Shakespeare, and there's something about that sort of heightened Old English that just has a fun rhythm and cadence to it that I think the reason so many of us would probably say, okay, we're not, and this is illustrated by the conversation we just had, like the reason we probably say we don't love poetry so much is because it is heightened language, and just the raw reading of it, like if you just sat down and read, a print version of a poem, will not do as much as it spoken aloud.
I agree.
And the point I'm trying to make there is in terms of songwriting, like just on a page isn't the same as translating it into the medium of voice, of vocalizing. And so I think, in preparation for this episode, being able to listen to Bill read it just elevated it. And again, I mean, I'm giving him specific props because he did us a favor and provided this for us. But the point I'm trying to make is simply the reading of it, a well executed reading of it, just has such a lusciousness to it that makes it so that you're not just like, oh, I'm just reading rhythm and meter that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
It's the ability to take that rhythm and meter and vocalize it in such a way that, oh, wow, that's a neat story being told. So yeah, I mean, right. I think pretty highly of this piece.
Yeah. And it's like something that our mutual college professor Keith always used to say, is that a play is only, half conceptualized until it's performed. And
sure,
I feel the same way about poetry, that I agree with you. I feel like something, in a way that prose just doesn't have the same sort of stigma around it. I think that that poetry really is intended to be performed, is intended to be read aloud, which was another reason why we wanted to present it to you guys this way, the way that we did. But I also think that this poem specifically, I think it's brilliant in its structure, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because, this is where two people with theater degrees get into literature. So that's,
it's at least a little closer cousin than science.
That's a good point. But, I know that there are people who devote their lives to the study of poetry and language. And, I don't want to be honest with you, I don't want to come off sounding too dumb, but one of the things that I do really appreciate about this particular poem is, two things that I'll mention. And if you have anything to add here, please do. But one thing that I noticed is the repetitive use of certain strong consonant sounds that create clicks and ticks, T's and K's that are used repetitively. And it reminds me of like the clatter of a bird's claws on like a pane of glass or something along the ground. And then there's also juxtaposed that with a lot of long O sounds and long vowel sounds that are sort of evocative of moaning. And I feel like the structure of this language is just very effective for creating, as you're listening to it, if you're being attentive to that, for creating those invocations in your head, that it sort of makes you think, sort of puts you on edge a bit, if you're really engaged with it, which I think is brilliant. And then the other thing that I'll call out is just the narrative itself. Like, it is a narrative poem, which certainly not all poems are narratives as well, but this is also a story poem. And I love how the progression of this, not only, I mean, our show is about the intersection between faith and the horror genre. And this is not only a narrative poem, but it's a horror story. This is a man descending into madness because of his grief. And whether or not this raven is some sort of haunting thing that has come to torment him, whether it is, some sort of divine messenger trying to provoke something healthy in him, or whether it is just an animal or a figment of his imagination, is largely left to the reader to interpret. But regardless of that, the poem definitely descends into a very horrific place, which if you really just dissect the language and read what's happening there at the end of the poem is truly horrific, which we'll get into when we get into theme. So I just really think it's brilliant. I think it's genius, and I think kids should study it just as a study of language and as a study of what the spoken word or the written word can do, and the power that it can have, even in brevity. Like the Raven is relatively brief to read. You can read it in under 10 minutes, and it's just really very, very powerful.
Well, and there's something to, in reiterating even in a novice manner, our appreciation for poetry is like, there's such an economy of language. There is intentionality in word choice and in structure and in syllable rhythm. There's just such an intentionality to it that makes it so that you can read it and an urgency develops, specifically in this one, because it is such a descent or potential descent, depending on your interpretation of this young man's overwhelming grief. So yeah, I mean, I find it fun. It's fun to talk about. It's fun to revisit. I'm glad you chose it for us to talk about. And,
that's, we obviously we're not doing our usual newly instituted David S. Pumpkins ratings for this. One of the big things that I want to just go ahead and dive into, if it's okay, is just to go ahead and start diving into theme, because most of this is really very thematically rich. I think it's there's so much going on in this poem, so many different ways to approach it. One of the first things that I wanted to I didn't pre-brief this question for you, so if you need a moment to think about it, I'll give you that moment. But I wonder, I've thought this a time or two as I was reading this, is this kind of an atheistic view of the world that's presented in this poem? And what I mean by that is just sort of the begging and pleading towards the end of it of being reunited with his love, or even hope that his love is okay, that she's dead, but is she okay? Is everything all right? And that constant repetitive refrain of nevermore. I don't necessarily, for myself, think that it's a purely atheistic view of the world, but I wonder if that's just me bringing my personal faith to the text. Is this presenting a world without God? Is it presenting a world without an afterlife? Is it presenting a world where all that awaits us at the end of life is void and nothingness? And again, I didn't pre-brief you, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
No, that's not a big question at all. I'm just kidding. It's quite a big question. I mean, I think there's a degree to where you're painting with a much broader brush than necessarily, the poem intends, though that, some doctoral student in Poe out there right now is like, oh my God, these guys are idiots. Specifically that bearded one.
If anybody with a doctorate who knows that Nathan has a beard is listening to this show,
I know. It's impressive.
Please write us. Yes. fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. Write us.
I do think there are echoes throughout of religious language, and even in re-listening to it, he begs, is there a balm in Gilead? This guy wants to know. I think more, for me personally, in my interpretation, it's more an examination of just overwhelming grief, and thus that's why I say is it painting an atheistic picture of the world feels like a really broad brush. I think it's painting a very specific moment in time for this character who may not get back up off the floor. I mean,
right.
It's pretty bleak in that regard.
Sure.
And again, like that would also go to the statement of, well, is he imagining this or not? If he's imagining it, well, the potential exists that in the world of this character that it is not an atheistic world. If it's a real bird, showing up as a devilish proxy saying nevermore, yeah, then maybe that's the case. Yeah. And see, this is what happens when you listen to The Fear of God. You get into, literary criticism.
Yeah. I mean, I think that where I sit with it ultimately is that I think it is a template, like we've discussed in other material we've talked about, like specifically I'm reminded of our conversation about It Follows, that there's some works of art that are really just templates with which you bring certain perspective about the world around you, perspective about faith or lack thereof, and you will take away from that material further evidence for your worldview, for your perspective. And I think The Raven is one of those things. I think dependent upon how you approach the material, you will either see evidence of, the lost in a God-filled world, or you'll see evidence of quite literally a sort of godless place. And I think that's part of the horror of it.
Yeah, let me throw something at you here. So I didn't pre-brief you on this, so it's surprises everywhere. And I was hesitant to jump into this because it's going to heavily reference a secondary source here. Man, this is awesome. We are like totally college papering this episode right now.
Hey, feels like old times.
Yeah, staying up all night, drinking soda. Although tonight I am drinking Angry Orchard hard cider. See, I've only had one.
Listeners are going to start taking a Rolodex of the drinks that you enjoy while we record.
Yes, I'm okay with that. I think you'll appreciate the turn I'm about to make here, and I want to chat about this and then we can dovetail back into wherever you might go. So as I was pondering The Raven, and so you're painting with this brush of God or not God, lost or not lost. I look at this and I think of more kind of microscopic, this guy. And, I asked this question, I think on Bone Tomahawk maybe, or I said, is this a hopeless movie?
Oh, yeah. Bone Tomahawk.
And you said, you threw at me Cautionary Tale. I'm going to do the same thing here for you.
Oh, no, that was The Witch.
Okay. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Witch. I knew it was somewhere in there. So to me, my lens I am bringing to this piece of literature is more as Cautionary Tale. I read this and this man's attachment, his obsession, his grief, and hear me, I will defend to the day is long your need to experience your grief. I'm not
right
dismissing the need for a person to process adequately their grief. Right. But clearly this man has stepped beyond grief into potential madness,
and insanity.
We've passed from grief into sorrow, into lament, into madness, into, as you just alluded, potential insanity here. Well, what it made me think of, and I'm going to trail on this for a minute, is, years ago, I've only read it once, but years ago reading The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis.
Oh, right. Wonderful book.
Yeah. Well, one of those characters has stayed with me forever since I read it. And it's the mom. In doing a little digging on this, they refer to her as the maternal ghost. And also, I can't remember if this is actually in the text, but she's referred to it. She has a name. Her name is Pam. I don't know I can't remember if that's actually in the book or not. But if you remember this scene and The Great Divorce, it's about these characters who are entering what they don't know, or trying to enter, or potentially entering heaven, will they, based on the attachments they still hold, be able to get in or not? And it's really beautiful, really powerful. Well, specifically this maternal ghost, or Pam, as we might call her, her son died 10 years prior. Well, in the 10 years since her son's death, she has maintained his bedroom. And she's at the entry point for this heavenly realm. And her husband, who has also passed away, is there greeting her. And she says, "Where is Michael?" That's the son. "Where is Michael?"
Yeah.
And when am I allowed to see him? And the husband says, "There's no question of being allowed. As soon as he can see you, you'll be able to see him." And there's this really powerful moment where he tells her the first step is the hard one. You will become, they use the language of solid and tangible, like these ghostly characters are not solid enough to enter yet. He says, you'll be solid enough for Michael to perceive you when you learn to want someone else besides Michael. And then he follows that with, and I'll finish quoting this here. He says, I don't say more than Michael, not as a beginning. That will come later. He says, it's only the little germ of a desire for God that we need to start the process. So it's this really haunting moment where this mother who can't let go of the death of her son a decade later is now being told, this does not mean you forget Michael. This does not mean in the Raven's language, you forget Lenore. Right. It does mean the desire for something better has to exist in order for the process of your healing to begin. And so, I don't know, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I don't know if that resonates with you. I don't know if I'm just pulling this out of left field, but this character in The Raven, who is so stricken with emotional turmoil and sorrow, like, that's what I hear is this sort of cautionary tale sort of example, like, not, again, you're not permitted your grief. You're not permitted to undergo what you need to undergo in order to move past. But
right.
The inability to move past, will in The Raven, it manifests as this insanity-inducing bird. In The Great Divorce, it manifests as this woman being basically denied entry to heaven, saying you've got to be able to move past in order to be able to thrive here. Right.
That's
a lot of stuff.
Yeah, but I think that the infusion of that whole, here's part of a large part of what I took away from what you're saying is that you can try so hard to hold on to what you've lost that you will lose yourself in the process.
Yes.
And I go back to the text of The Raven, where in the second stanza, he says, eagerly I wish the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. So what he's saying there is, I'm desperately trying to find some distraction for this grief that I'm suffering with. And it is in the midst of this desperate effort to seek distraction that he hears the raven outside of his window, and then, eventually lets the raven in. And what are we left with by the end of the poem is he said that raven still is sitting, never flitting, still is sitting, still is sitting. It's this image that shadow that he let into his house is never going to be lifted, never more going to be lifted specifically. Right. And I do think I think that's absolutely a danger in our journey through our own grief, that the harder we try to hold on to something, and I think that's something that's fascinating about this poem in general, is that he seems simultaneously, to me, the narrator in this poem seems simultaneously desperate to remember and desperate to forget. He seems like both are happening at the same time. And one of the things that is interesting, I'll bring up another C.S. Lewis book because it's oddly appropriate in this moment. I didn't expect to, but his book, A Grief Observed, which is it's nonfiction. It's very epistolary. He's just writing in a journal, a letter to anybody who will read it about traveling through the grief of the loss of his wife to cancer. And he opens the book iconically with, no one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. And it's a powerful understanding of the process that he's about to walk through. But in it, he observed something that I can't quote verbatim, but he scratched at an idea where he said, I'm scared of forgetting my wife. Now, not that of forgetting that she have existed, or not forgetting, what she looked like even, or anything like that, but I'll forget her. I'll forget the fact that when she was flesh and blood and living and right here in the room with me, she constantly surprised me. Every single day, she would say or do something unexpected that I didn't know, and now all I'm left with are the memories of the things that she had done in the past, and I'm going to forget the imminent presence of her being here with me. And I feel like the narrator in The Raven has that same sort of struggle, that his Lenore is gone, and he's desperate still to have her with him. And he even says towards the end of the poem, he says that, that's one of the demands that he makes of the raven, as he demands to say, will you please give me some assurance that on the other side, in heaven, he calls it Aden here, that on the other side, I'm going to be reunited with her. Give me some assurance somehow that there's something waiting on the other end. And then of course,
but see, wouldn't you say, but then wouldn't you say like that's the Great Divorce example? Like, cause see, you just said what to me sound like two different things. Not let me know there's something else beyond this. It's let me know she's there. Like those are two different things, right?
Oh, no, I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that tension exists in the poem. I do think that this narrator is moving through an unhealthy circumstance in his grief. Like he's alone for one thing. Right. He's absolutely alone, and he's alone by choice because he says to the raven, that's how I read that line where he says, let my loneliness be unbroken. Sure. So he wants to be alone. Yeah. But see, don't you think he's isolated himself?
This is fun. So I feel like we should take this a step further. Maybe this is where you're angling anyway. I don't know, but because there's a way in which I think people could listen to us, listeners could listen to us right now and be like, dang, y'all's cold. You won't let people just lament their lost loved ones. Like, I'm not saying that at all, but I do think, and I don't think that's what you're saying either, but I do think there's a way we could spend hours unpacking these ideas, what it means to adequately, healthily move forward after grief has been, in C.S. Lewis's word, observed. It makes me think of, we're just pulling in all the references right now. It makes me think of Arrival, the movie Arrival.
Oh, yes.
And what a beautiful, beautiful movie, basically about if you knew you were going to lose Lenore, if C.S. Lewis, you knew you were going to lose your wife, if we knew the travails we would go through in our life that might result in loss, would we still go through them? Right. And that particular movie, and I think our faith would say that life isn't life without all of those things.
Yes.
And there's a way in which you have to, is this working out your faith with fear and trembling? Not as in, what do I believe? And let me study and pore over that, but as in, how will what I believe determine how I survive? How I not just survive, but thrive? Right. There's this way in which I feel like we're always, not you and I, but like, as people of faith, we're always like, well, do I believe X about the faith or do I believe Y? Like, there's a way in which those sorts of conversations feel moot in the face of just living one's life in faith. Does that make sense?
Right. Oh, yes. No, absolutely. What I would add to that is it brings up for me all the times that we try to pitch faith as a security against loss, that we try to pitch faith as the, they'll give lip service to the fact that it's not easy street, but then you listen to them talk about the benefits of following Jesus, and sure enough, they're sure trying to sell you easy street, or at least a large majority of people are. And it's one of those things where we have to have a healthy understanding of the fact that loss is inevitable. I remember talking to a couple of people who we had some friends. We weren't terribly close to the friends who suffered this loss, but we were very close to some of their friends who were close to them. There was a couple that we knew who very tragically and sadly lost a 9-month-old child to SIDS. And it was something where a lot of people in their immediate circle were really trying to understand why such tragedy had hit this home and why such a devastating loss had taken place so unexpectedly. And I can remember one person particularly reached out to me at one point and asked me, like, what am I supposed to feel? What am I supposed to think about these things? We prayed. We asked God for help. This child is going to receive a funeral. What are we supposed to do? And I don't have even close to the ballpark of an understanding about why any of those things happen. But what I said in response to that person is I said, death is inevitable for each and every one of us, both of those we love and of us ourselves. Death is absolutely inevitable. But what I think our faith gives us hope for, first and foremost, is that death is nothing to be feared.
Sure.
That even though it hurts like hell, especially when it's in situations like that where others would be, frankly, rather justified to shake a big fist at God and say, why this? Why me? All of those kinds of questions. But I think for us, resting back in what we believe about the truth of the gospel is that death is not something to be afraid of. We had discussed when we did our episode about The Exorcist, because we were also kind of tributing the now late William Peter Blatty. He had written a book, a nonfiction book that is mostly memoir, but also talking about the loss of his son, which was a sudden death. And he dedicated the book in a way that just hit me so hard, even when I just opened the book. Because when he did, for those of you who don't know what I'm referring to, when you open up the text of any book, it's going to be dedicated most of the time to someone's wife or to someone's friend or to someone's family member. But when you open up this book, which was called Finding Peter, when you open up the book, it says, to all of those who have lost a dear loved one to that liar and fraud named death. And the aggressiveness of the language hit me very hard, in that here is a man who is stating boldly, and I think from his perspective, honestly, death is a liar and death is a fraud, because it wants you to believe that it will have the final word. And It does not have the final word.
Sure.
We as Christians believe that. Now, there's a great many people listening to this. Well, I don't know if they're listening to this show, but there's a great many people who could be listening to this that may be materialist thinkers, that think that this is all there is, and that when we die, we are absorbed back into nature, that we just become part of the cycle of nature and natural progression of events. I don't believe that. I don't agree with that worldview. I don't agree with that perspective. So to me, as a believer, one of my fundamental beliefs is not only grief, but pain and suffering and loss. They hurt. They hurt terribly, but they are not going to have the final word. And I will stand on that for as long as I possibly can.
And don't you think there's this powerful tension that has to exist where, I'm backpedaling a little bit to some stuff you were saying earlier about, this family you were referencing specifically, but each of us have our own versions of loss and pain. And, there's a way in which it's so hard. It's so hard to give advice to people going through those things. It's so hard to receive advice as someone going through those things.
Yeah.
Because everyone wants there to be, they don't want there to be, but our impulse is, let's just move past this, and hear me. I don't even mean people will say that callously, but there's this sentiment of like, let's pat each other on the back. What are the pithy sort of token sort of Christianese we can apply to this situation to try to bring each other comfort, that just don't do justice to the pain and the sorrow and the situation.
Right. Right.
I mean, there's a reason the title of suffering servant reverberates through history, much less scripture, in terms of Jesus's role. Like, you don't sign up for this thing, whether we're talking faith in God or just living your life, and not have some expectation that we're gonna hit some serious bumps.
Right.
Whether it's actual death, whether it's disease, whatever. And I look at the example of Jesus, who had his garden moment where, if not thy will, take this from me.
Right. Is there any other way?
Yeah. Like I look at something like that and I think we're all allowed that sort of moment, but what happens next? You have your moment, and you may have more than one of those moments. You may have dozens of those moments in a specific scenario. But if the example of Jesus is worth following at all, you still then, with the help of the Comforter, bear up under that pain for as long as that season lasts.
Yeah.
And for some, that season can be a very long time. For some, it's a little less so. But I just think there's a way we try to apply Band-Aids to things that just won't and shouldn't have Band-Aids applied to them.
Yes,
like,
right. Right.
This young man in this story, I don't want to belittle his actual pain. I would say there is a sense in which, like the husband saying to the wife, like, you don't replace Lenore, but there has to be something to live for. You've got to move forward in a way that honors, but also permits you to live, because, this in both Great Divorce and The Raven, there's a lot of language of ghosts. You don't want to be that ghost. And we become those ghosts when we let our problems, when we let the pain of our life just destroy us and devastate us and keep us from being, you may never be whole again. You may have a limp,
right.
You may walk with a limp. You wrestle with the Lord, you walk away with a limp, but you got to keep walking. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. 'Cause what he does and what we have the tendency to do is again, as we've talked about before on the show, is demand control. Demand some sense of help me to control this situation. When the Raven first comes in, the man considers him almost a joke, or like, whew, it's just a bird. But by the end of the poem, he is pleading, begging with every inch of his life to this bird that, like a parrot, just keeps repeating the same word over and over again. And he demands evidence and sees this bird as evidence of something. And so he descends into madness because he's desperate to control this pesky thing that keeps nagging at him about it, and he won't surrender, and he digs in and won't relent. I'll mention the scripture verse that I had thought to bring in, and then as possibly a way to wind down, I'll mention one more thing from A Grief Observed. So I've taken to, I don't know what to say when my friends lose loved ones. I don't know what to write. I don't know how to console people. Most of the time I try to simply be there and be present and let them talk and listen, and that's about as much as I try to do. But if I do reference a scripture, one of the ones that I will tend to go to is the one that I'll reference now, which is one of my favorite passages of scripture in Revelation chapter 21. Revelation 21:4 says, "He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." And I heard, please don't laugh too much or derail us, but I heard from an old Petra song that there will come a day when death dies, that when death itself will be consumed by a greater force, and when it will be no more. The old order of things, the curse itself, will have passed away. And one of the things, talking about the control that the man in the Raven is seeking, and talking about our own processes through grief, A Grief Observed ends in one of the most profoundly beautiful observations that I think I have ever heard or read in any book about grief. In the book, C.S. Lewis is talking about, he's trying to figure out why his wife smiled when she died, like right before she died. And he talks about, maybe she was joyed at the sight of my presence. Maybe she saw some glimpse of heaven, something. He's trying to figure out why she smiled. And towards the end, he comes to the conclusion that it really wasn't ever about him to begin with. That it really wasn't, that he was so wrapped up in himself and making even this person's existence all about his pain. The fact that this person was here was now all about him. And it ends with just the simple line, as she died, she smiled, but not at me. And it's, to me, speaks volumes about when we get into this situation where we're desperate for control, where we're looking for evidence in the world around us, in every single coincidental thing that happens, whether it's, birds flying by at a particular moment, or landing on the busts above our door, or, take it into your own world, certain coincidental things that have happened, and you're desperate to maintain some sort of control. I would just encourage you to do as much as you can in your process of grief to remember that ultimately there are things beyond us that we can take great hope in, that there are things at work beyond just this life and death cycle, and that death will not ultimately have, we believe, will not ultimately have the final word, and that there will come a day where the final word on death will be when it itself passes away. And I think there is unspeakable hope in that. I think there's just profound hope in recognizing that though we endure these things and suffer these things, that they will not be forever and possibly will not be for long in the scheme of things. Did you have anything else you wanted to?
No,
add?
I mean, as well, a thought as we're pondering all things lofty and eternal. I had a dear friend from high school, about 5 years ago now, lost his mother in a very tragic, sudden car accident. And I started at that point, as someone who, I think you would speak to this too, who tries to live their faith out in a way that hopefully will not be considered trite or, shallow. Something I've begun doing, and don't hold me to this, every listener out there, but something I've begun doing for Facebook friends, or friends of mine who suffer loss like that is, I believe, random caveat, I believe kind of all truth is God's truth, and the Lord can use things other than specifically scripture references to minister and heal. And I was, and I'll cite this specifically. When I lost my grandmother about 7 or 8 years ago, this was very powerful to me. And it was, we're using all these references today, from Lord of the Rings. It was Tolkien. And it's, the scene of Gandalf and Pippin on the wall during the Battle of Gondor, and they think all is lost. And, Pippin is articulating, thinking the end is here, and there you go. And Gandalf says, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path, one that we all must take. He says, the gray rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And this is the best part. He says, and then you see it. And Pippin says, what, Gandalf? See what? And Gandalf just says, white shores, and beyond a far green country under a swift sunrise. And the moment ends with Pippin quietly saying, well, that isn't so bad. And Gandalf says, no, it isn't. And that just gives me a great comfort and hope, and sort of reinforces, I think, kind of what we're talking about here, that, you bear up under the weight of things, knowing that you have your Gandalf, you have Christ, the suffering servant right there with you, who will say to you, this is what is to come. And you can say that doesn't sound bad at all. Mm-hmm. And he'll say, no, it isn't.
Amen to that.
On that note.
Well, listeners, thank you so much for taking this journey with us. And we hope you enjoy the reading by Bill Oberst Jr. I want to thank him again for participating in this in his very special way. And if you have anything that you'd like to say about this, you want to correct us on our literary references, you want to educate us on on all of the ways in which we didn't bring up this topic and that topic, then please feel free. You can do so in a variety of ways, because the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but it is nevermore the end of the conversation.
Nice.
We probably the easiest way to reach us is through Twitter. Nathan, what is our Twitter handle?
At the Fear of God.
You can also like us on Facebook and follow us there. You can leave comments on our posts, or you can post there yourself. You can go to morethanonelesson.com and leave a comment on this official post. You can also follow me on Twitter at Reed Lackey. And Nathan, where can they find you on Twitter besides at the Fear of God?
At the Nathan Rouse.
And you could also please go and leave us an iTunes review. If you've enjoyed this content or enjoy what we produce every week, we would really appreciate some more iTunes reviews. So pop over there and say some good things about us. Tell your friends about us. And lastly, but not least, you can email us at fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. We would really love to hear from each and every one of you. And you can also tune into social media to see where we're going to be going next week. I'm not going to officially say here, because recent events might change up our lineup. So look to social media to see where we're going to be going next week, and we will see you then. Nathan, as always, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
Likewise, my friend.
And we'll catch you guys next week. See you then.
Nevermore.